Good afternoon, everyone. This is Andy, National League of Institute for Youth Education and Families, welcoming you to today's webinar on city leaders supporting nature access during the pandemic. This is one of a series of webinars that we'll be bringing to you on sustaining nature connections at this time. In my work at the Institute for Youth Education and Families at National League of Cities, it's my great pleasure and privilege to co-lead the Cities Connecting Children to Nature initiative with my colleagues at Children and Nature Network. And we're so glad that so many people could join in to today's call to get a conversation going about the response by city leaders. Today we hope to look at that balance that city leaders are having to strike between providing residents with access to nature while still addressing and responding to current public health concerns and physical distancing guidelines. Before we begin, a couple of notes about the format. We do encourage you to comment and share your ideas via the chat box located for most people on the left-hand side of your screen. My colleagues are going to be monitoring that and shipping questions over to us for responses and later in the webinar. If there's a clarifying question, I'll try to jump in to make sure everything is clear. For the moment, everyone else on the line is muted. To enrich our discussion and kick it off today, we have recruited a variety of strong presenters who are all working with the Children and Nature, the Cities Connecting Children and Nature initiative in different ways. Two of them come from cities that are part of our technical assistance cohort in the initiative. Brandon Denton, who's Assistant Director of Education in the City of Houston, and Jesus Aguirre, Superintendent of Seattle Parks and Recreation. Also, it's great to be joined by colleagues from the National Recreation and Parks Association, Rachel Banner, who's Director of Park Access there, and also by Karen Ernst, the Director of Strategic Initiatives at City Parks Alliance. So you'll have opportunities to ask questions to the presenters directly. In case it's helpful for those of us who may not be familiar, briefly describe the Cities Connecting Children to Nature initiative, which is in its 6th year of operation, touching several dozen cities very directly around the U.S. and hopefully touching still more through our constant efforts to get out the lessons learned and examples from the initiative. But the CCCN, as we affectionately call it, supports city governments to connect children to nature more equitably through a combination of technical assistance, peer learning, and pass-through funds. We work with cities to support systemic change through policies, infrastructure, and programs, and it's our contention that we need to pay attention to all three if we really want to move the proverbial needle. We started in 2014 with 7 cities, working very directly with 7 cities, and have now grown to a direct technical assistance cohort of 18 cities. It's support from the JPB Foundation that makes this all possible. We're seeing cities pursue a variety of strategies to connect children to nature more equitably. And of course, as inequities get brought into starker relief by the COVID-19 pandemic, we're trying to help cities respond and trying to learn from cities' responses. So I'm ready to transition now into a facilitated talk show mode, and we've asked our our speakers to get ready to talk about a small number of questions, and some of those will be supported with some visuals that they've provided to us. So, Brandon, can you kick us off here? Tell us about the current situation or context in Houston with regard to park and nature access. What are some key leadership steps that Mayor Turner, the council, or city departments have taken to date?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the introduction, Andy, and thank you all for allowing me to be a part of the conversation. I've never been a part of a talk show before, so I think that's really cool, Andy, since you're having a talk show format. But thank you to NLC, Children of Nature Network, everybody that's involved. A lot has changed in Houston as it has around the world, right? When we try to summarize or explain the coronavirus here in Houston in comparison to other crises we have experienced, most recently Hurricane Harvey, I think there's no comparison, right? Mayor gives one of the best analogies that I've heard in how we can explain what this is. He says with Harvey, Hurricane Harvey, for example, you can look at a radar on a map and you can see kind of where it started in the Gulf of Mexico, right? And you can kind of see or understand or track when it's coming. And you can also look at, where it may end or when it may end. But with a virus like coronavirus or COVID-19, you can't see it. And so it's an invisible enemy. You know it exists, but you can't quite pinpoint it. And that's a scary feeling. I know that is for the people of Houston, as it is for other people around, the state of Texas and America. So when life was really normal, uh, the parks and nature spaces were a safe place to go. We could all congregate there for recreational and educational activities. We could walk the trails. We can simply go out and get a breath of fresh air. But the evolution of this has changed, the way that we do things, and everybody's had to kind of pivot. And I just highlighted it for some of the inequity and the inequity and access issues we knew that existed, what I like to call BC or before coronavirus. There was already a lack of access to green spaces in underdeveloped neighborhoods. There was already a decreasing interest and awareness and connection to nature for children in some of the most densely populated areas. Because Houston is large, 650 square miles of space, people believe that everybody has a backyard or a front yard, and that's not necessarily the case, even for the fourth largest city. When it comes to technology, we've been working with school districts, telecom companies, internet service providers to create a plan for children and families to get access to computers and internet to do schoolwork, or to even, just have something to do. So that digital divide is also a part of this pandemic, on this crisis, and it's probably spread us even further apart, at least in terms of the physical and digital side. But with that said, we're facing challenges that none of us have experienced before. And at the same time, we're experiencing challenges that none of us alive have seen. But good news is our CCCM partners have been working on solutions for a long time with leadership from people like Mayor. Uh, we we are working on formulating those strategies to help implement those solutions, even during this pandemic. So a lot of things have been happening in Houston with as you can see in our infographic there. Houston Parks and Recreation Department has been shooting at a moving target. One day is that we can have people in the parks. One day, or at least around Easter weekend, we actually closed the parks because we knew a lot of people were going to be wanting to congregate. But we are where our community centers may be closed. We are also, we've been able to transition those spaces so that we can even serve food for the people that were part of summer enrichment programs, after school enrichment programs, and so forth. I think we have about 50 sites, but parks and nature spaces still remain open as long as everybody adheres to some of the ordinances or orders around social distancing and such. But yeah, a lot of different things are going on in Houston. I can elaborate more, but I know we have some other people that are in the chat as well. You want to continue, or you want me to pass it on?
Yeah, let's go to Seattle for a comparative perspective. Jesus,
Sure.
what are one or two things that you and Mayor Durkin have steps you've taken since to respond to the pandemic?
Sure. Well, thank you, Andy, and I want to echo Brandon's sort of appreciation to everyone for organizing this. Certainly, our Children of Nature Network and National League of Cities, and many thanks to CPA and NRPA for bringing all of us together. I think much like Brandon mentioned, we've had to a lot has changed in Seattle since this epidemic, this emergency has kicked off. What I like to tell my team and sort of the communication we've been sharing is that we no longer run a Department of Parks and Recreation in the way we used to run it pre-COVID-19. Before the outbreak, and you can see the graphic here, like many other parks and recreation agencies, we're really focused on bringing people together, getting them active, to play, learn, etc. Our goal was for people to be healthy, the environment to be healthy, and to build strong communities. And we did that across our inventory of amenities, our parks and open space, all of our facilities, our buildings, and with a really great team. But all that has changed. I don't know if we have the next slide kind of gives you a little bit more of a kind of where we are, how we got to where we are now. And I won't go through all of these, but in a few short weeks, we've seen that life for Parks and Recreation certainly, but for every resident of the city of Seattle has changed. A couple things of note here, like Brandon stated, we closed all of our facilities back in the middle of March, canceled all of our programs, all of our rentals, and sort of progressively moved as we got guidance from the health professionals, closing our high touch areas like playgrounds and picnic shelters, etc. And then sort of when our governor instituted a stay-at-home order, we were then given the mandate by our own Mayor Durkin, to then begin sort of our continuity of operations implementation, which essentially, again, shifts our work from a regular Parks and Recreation to now an agency that is an agency supporting a citywide effort in response to the emergency. And some of the things that we're doing now that are very different is, we operate shelters for our unsheltered individuals. We have public showering facilities, again, for some of our unsheltered individuals. We provide emergency childcare for first responders. We are also trying to preserve and maintain our amenities so that when we're able to ramp back up, we can do that in a way that is safe, but also we continue to have access to these things. And then really just continue to struggle with how to manage the assets that we have in a way that still supports this idea that we fundamentally believe that parks and open space and green space are critical to everyone for mental and physical well-being. Our governor, our stay-at-home order says such, but we're worried about crowding. So we've had to make some changes, just like in Houston, we also closed all of our parks for the Easter holiday weekend, but we tried really hard to make sure that we kept all of our neighborhood parks open to ensure that we can continue to provide access for folks. So again, within the world of Seattle Parks and Recreation, we are now in full mission essential functions. The things that I identified are the only things that we're doing. Many of our staff are telecommuting. Certainly those are in high risk populations, but the ones that are not performing essential functions are at home. We are, again, supporting the functions that are driven by the mayor and by the data that tells us here's what we should be doing in terms of response to the outbreak. So I think I'll stop there and just kind of share again that as Brandon said, I certainly have not seen anything like this, and most of us haven't. I think what's really challenging for us now is how do we begin to ramp back up? And I think there's so many questions that are still unanswered for us, and so we're continuing to try to find as much information as we can to do that.
Yeah. Well, thanks to both of you, and I will pull Rachel and Karen in a minute, but I wanted to sort of bracket your responses on what the city has been doing in each of your cases to what you're hearing. I'd like to explore what you're hearing from residents, either via public input channels that may be happening virtually now, or how people are voting with their feet in terms of nature access. How are you experiencing that down in Houston, Brandon?
Yeah, I'll give you a prime example. Yesterday, I moderated a teen town hall that YMCA put together with a bunch of leaders. The Harris County Judge, Juliet, from our office, and some of the council members and people in mental health and Texas Children's Hospitals and others. And some of the questions that the teens uh, gave us or presented to us were around like anxiety and feelings of isolation because one, the schools are closed; they have nothing else to do. We're going on 4 or 5 weeks of school closures, and the teens and youth are ready to get out of the house. So they were asking questions about when will this be over? When will this end? How can they even ask how can we help or what could we be doing during this time to if we can't be around all of our friends in social spaces, what can we be doing? And some of the recommendations from our Parks and Recreation department have been around using social media and hashtags, using technology, creating nature art projects, and planning home gardens, like at home do it yourself projects. We've been some suggesting that they do family scavenger hunts for native plants, for trees, for bugs, for wildlife, do geocaching and utilizing some of the apps like Leaf Snap, Florifolio, Wild App Bird, My Nature, and some of those just to get those students and those teens and those youth out there playing in nature during this pandemic as well. Jaime Gonzalez from the Nature Conservancy and the partners like Texas Parks and Wildlife and the Texas Master Naturalists are doing the City Nature Challenge starting on tomorrow through the 27th. I'm working on getting Mayor to announce that so that everybody can find ways to still be outside and be in nature, but still do it in a safe and fun way. On yesterday, Mayor actually announced on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day our new climate action plan, which has the goals of having us to uh, I guess with the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, to be more carbon neutral, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to lead basically this global energy transition. So that was kind of a kickstart on or making those types of announcements, get
Hmm.
everybody involved when the mayor's office is leading the charge. So on Earth Day, we're making that announcement, build some awareness around what it means to have a cleaner, safer Houston, even during this pandemic, where most of us are in this stay home, work safe order. The air is actually cleaner. Animals are actually going outside. I've discovered more bird languages than I've ever had in before in my life. I can pick out a red robin or a blue jay or a mockingbird because I've had the time to work at home and sit on my balcony and observe myself. So that's a positive part. But Mayor and the Office of Education and our stakeholders in the nature and green spaces are doing what we can to keep people active, to have people not lose their minds, but still create that equity and access to nature.
Thanks, Brandon. Examples, Jesus, of what you're hearing from the public or how you're seeing them, quote unquote, vote with their feet about nature access currently?
Yeah, well, I think we like every other city, when the weather turns and gets beautiful, people absolutely vote with their feet and get outdoors. And we had a pretty significant surge in people coming to our parks and our trails when the weather started to get nicer out here. But again, as we were concerned about that, we tried to implement some strategies to keep people safe. We've put a lot of restrictions in terms of how people can access our parks, and generally we've gotten great feedback from people. People understand why we're doing this, and we have some situations where parks get so crowded, and it isn't because people don't want to comply, they just can't because there's too many people. So we've been doing a lot of messaging both on social media and signage to just encourage folks to, if you get to a park and it's too crowded, go to another park, and really pushing our smaller neighborhood parks. We have 485 parks in our system, but 15 of the big ones are the ones that everybody likes to go to. So we're encouraging folks that if you have to drive or even bike there, it's probably too far. Stay close to home, and things like that. I think. But generally, we're getting some really good feedback from folks in terms of the restrictions that we're needing to put in place.
Yeah. Rachel and then Karen, would love to call on you to put some of what we're hearing from these two cities in a broader context of what you're hearing across your respective memberships. Rachel, can you kick off a little bit about what you're learning from surveying your NRPA members, and then we'll turn to Karen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for inviting us to be a part of this webinar. For those who are unfamiliar with NRPA, we're the National Recreation and Park Association. We have a membership of over 60,000 park and recreation professionals from across the country, representing cities like Seattle and Houston, all the way to very small, tiny towns in the middle of America. So we are doing our best through this time to ensure that we're lifting up the voices of our park and recreation professionals and supporting them through things like our joint statement on using parks and open space while maintaining physical distancing. We thought it was critically important for people to be able to access these spaces given their local, state, and federal guidelines and being respective of the physical distancing protocols that have been recommended. We also have been surveying our membership on a weekly basis. Some of the questions have stayed consistent and others have varied depending on the needs of our communities at each week. And what Jesus and Brendan have said is very reflective of what our surveys are showing, that most park and recreation agencies continue to keep open all of their trails, local parks, regional parks, and community gardens, but that specific amenities within park spaces may be closed. So 94% of playgrounds, for example, we see a great number of beaches, outdoor sports fields and courts that are closed, as well as dog parks. So again, what Brendan and Jesus have shared is very reflective of what is happening across the country. NRPA has also helped support by putting out, I think a couple slides ago, you saw an infographic with the recommendations for physical distancing in parks. This is now supported by the CDC's specific parks and recreation recommendations that came out last week. So if you haven't seen those, I would recommend folks to check that out. The other thing I'll mention in terms of city response is that we've seen a significant wave in the sort of response that's happened. So certainly Seattle was one of the first places where COVID was present, and we're seeing now questions coming in from cities who have just now gotten their first case. So, you know, every community and every city is in a very different place when it comes to physical distancing, and would recommend that you check your state and local guidelines as to what might be most appropriate in your communities. And then quickly on sort of a response from people in our communities and the general public, we also have been reinstituted our NRPA Park Pulse, which is a survey that goes out to adults in the United States. And through this pulse, we have found that 83% of adults find exercising at local parks, trails, and open space essential to maintaining their mental and physical health during COVID-19 pandemic. And we have also found that about 60% say it's a very or extremely essential service to exercise in parks and green spaces, both to relieve stress and remain healthy during this crisis. So people are certainly voting with their feet. They're certainly behind the work of Parks and Recreation. And I've been on a couple of calls now with large groups of park and recreation professionals who not only are responding to ensure that people can still be connected to nature, but they're providing meals to kids. They're opening homeless shelters. They're making hand sanitizer, and the list continues to grow. And the more I hear, the more inspired I am by the work of park and recreation professionals on the ground. They are really ensuring that our communities are healthy and safe during this time period, and cannot thank them enough for the work that they're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And Karen, City Park Alliance moved very rapidly to searching out information and get into dialogue with its membership as well. What are you hearing? Both. What would you add to what Rachel was describing as the general response from agencies, and also about the interplay between public and agency folks?
Yeah. So I'm with the City Parks Alliance, and our membership, we're also a membership organization. Our membership is both public agencies, but it's also their nonprofit and private sector partners. And one of the things we've heard is the partnerships have been so critical in this that with the agencies really having to focus so much on emergency response, the nonprofit partners are the ones that are often able to spend the time and energy on doing the more creative programming that the agencies are just unable to spend as much time on right now. So that's been one trend that's been really interesting. But we're certainly seeing what the rest of them are seeing, and I won't repeat what other people have said, but that in terms of city park agencies are doing everything they can to help people safely use the parks through on-site signage. One trend we're seeing is getting trail maps out there and finding ways to encourage people onto the less used trails and out into more natural areas. Another trend we're seeing is cities closing roads within parks, but then also leading outside of parks to open up more area for people, pedestrians and cyclists, to get physical activity while there's still physical distancing. We've also seen a big trend in cities coming up with new programming to connect families to nature, people of all ages to nature. A couple of the ones I'd point out that I think are pretty creative. Miami-Dade County has the Playground, which is an online collection of resources to help people stay active, a lot of programming ideas. Montgomery Parks has their Explore from Home program, which is also really robust and creative. Willamette Lane, Oregon is a multi-jurisdiction coordinated effort. They've started their Families from Home program. Again, lots of really great resources in there. And then the final thing I'll say is that one trend is that because in a lot of low-income communities, there's not access to neighborhood parks or neighborhood green spaces. It's often coming down to just helping people access the most basic forms of nature in their neighborhoods, just street trees, traffic triangles, birds, whatever they can get too close to home, and that has just become really critically important at this time. So a couple organizations are doing really innovative things to encourage that even most basic form of access to nature. Piedmont Park Conservancy has their 1 foot hike, which I love. It's just going outside, standing in a green spot, looking 12 inches from your feet and seeing what kind of nature you can find there. Memphis Park Partnership has their nature scavenger hunt. Piedmont Park Conservancy is doing a backyard bingo. Charleston, South Carolina has their bird blast. So I would just encourage people to go and look at these. We've collected a lot of these resources from those programs and put it on our resource library so it makes it easier for people to replicate and implement those programs. Yeah,
thanks, Karen. And I think we have overlapping resource libraries between City Parks Alliance, NRPA, CCCN. So there are multiple places, multiple doors folks can knock on. But let's pivot a little bit to the topic you're raising, which is that we're starting from a reality, as Jesus and Brandon acknowledged, and you all have reinforced, that depending on how you define it, access to nature does not start out as an equal condition for everybody in every city, town, village, hamlet in America. So what is happening currently to try to keep pushing toward more equitable access to nature for children and families, even at a time when this is getting balanced with shutdowns, restrictions, et cetera? Jesus, is that a topic you could weigh in on briefly, and before we hear from others?
Sure, I can start. And I think as Brandon, I think, mentioned at the very beginning, when emergencies like this happen, all of the inequities that exist just get highlighted even more and magnified. And I think we certainly see that across our city as well. But I think some of the things that we've been trying to do, frankly, is just try to keep as many things open as possible. And there's been a lot of pressure to close things, just given our sort of the evolving way in which the health information that we're getting, keeps coming to us. So, we're trying really hard to just keep things open. And although there are some communities that don't have as much access as others, I think at least in Seattle, we're very lucky that we've got pretty good coverage in terms of access to open space, particularly with our small neighborhood parks. But also doing some things, working with our partners with the Department of Transportation, starting a Safe Streets program and opening up some streets to do the same thing. Our biggest, or sort of our busiest park in the network is one that we've had to make some significant modifications to the way it's used, including closing one of the streets that's adjacent to it that just creates a really nice connection to another park that's across the street. And then we sort of have increased the size of that open space tremendously. But really continue to focus on that access. So for example, when we first started having significant crowding issues at our big parks, we closed our parking lots. And of course, that creates a disparate impact on folks with disabilities. So we're trying now to create some parking spaces available just for folks with those needs, while still trying to limit access to everyone else. But I guess the last thing I'll say is from a citywide perspective, I think many of our communities struggle generally to get information from what we're doing, and I think really our city's done a pretty good job to double down on continuing to provide information out to every community in multiple languages. So all of our messaging is we try to translate it into the key 7 languages here. The city does a weekly webinar for community-based organizations to sort of just give them regular updates and so that they can disseminate to their groups. And I guess one more thing I'll say is we also are really cognizant of the fact that in addition to the access challenges here, we also have significant financial challenges, particularly for our partner organizations. We have dozens and dozens of partner organizations, both who are in our buildings, but also who are grant recipients. And very early on, our mayor was very aggressive about trying to provide things like rent abatement to our artists who are renting facilities in our parks, or rent deferrals, and then looking to make sure to see how we can support the grantees that we have, because when we emerge from this and come back out of this, we're really going to need them, and we want to do whatever we can to keep them afloat. And many of these community-based organizations are the ones that we've learned a great deal from in terms of engaging with our neediest community. So we want to do whatever we can to help them too.
Wow, great list and lots to think about there, Jesus. And by the way, if time permits, there were some questions coming in about the ambassador program. Curiosity about that. We'll have to, if not during the course of the webinar, we'll provide a link out if there's a story to be told about that. But Brandon, so Houston was a city with a kind of a zone-based approach to increasing equity across the city prior to the pandemic, and how have you tried to keep momentum going, promoting equity and access to nature during this moment?
I won't say me solely, but with our leadership and Mayor Sylvester Turner, even as recently as this week, he announced that we will have a new COVID-19 recovery and relief czar, a person that will be in charge of doing exactly that, keeping everybody on task, coming up with a plan of how we can reopen parks, reopen businesses, how can we get people back into their office buildings so they can start working and not necessarily having to telecommute. But within that, under the leadership of our new czar, Marvin Odom, comes all these other subgroups or committees for at-risk communities. We have a press conference today, or happening right now actually, where we'll be talking about what some of those plans are, whether it's digital learning, digital access, whether it's food distribution, or all the inequities that translate or transfer into all those different issues that we're facing prior to COVID and as of now. What I've been doing on a lot of our calls with stakeholders and different programs is explaining or having them think in terms of just like any other national disaster or crisis or pandemic, 9/11, Hurricane Harvey, and so forth. This is going to change the way we live our lives, how we do business, how we treat people, how we engage in hygiene, right? And so our city and our mayor is taking the proactive approach as much as we possibly can, right, to try to address some of these issues. And that comes with putting teams together, put some of the greatest minds together, so that we can come up with a strategy and a plan how to address this as we speak, how to stand up, how to respond, how to create, and then how to create infrastructure so that should this happen again, I'm sure it will, we'll be a little bit more prepared, at least to the best of our abilities.
Thanks, Brandon.
But
And
I'm sorry.
Karen,
Go ahead.
Karen, one of the areas where City Parks Alliance has gathered some resources is on this topic of ensuring a focus on equity or continuing to try to resolve inequities during this time. So tell us a little bit about maybe with some visual support where you all have gone with this.
Yeah, so as they've already pointed out, the equity crisis has been around for a long time, and this COVID crisis has only brought the consequences into stark relief. So for the last 18 months, we've been working on an equitable funding for parks and green infrastructure. We worked with the Urban Institute to put out a report that came out last June that's strategies for funding parks and green infrastructure in low-income communities. And then this past January, we put out another report that's focused on case studies of cities that are driving data-driven equitable investment approaches in their cities. We are also working right now on what we're calling an equitable funding hub. That'll be a place on our website people can go to navigate all of this information and find strategies, funding strategies that would be most effective for them for funding parks and green infrastructure in low-income communities.
Yeah, you've also been active at City Parks in directing mayors and similarly situated folks to information about federal funding streams. And is there any hint of park equity funding coming through any of the stimulus packages so far?
Well, I know that there's a big effort. We're working with our partners, including NRPA, on some legislative packages and trying to get into the stimulus packages. And so there's efforts going into driving more funding through the ORLP, which has a very strong equity focus to it. And there's actually a big push right now to get a much larger chunk of money put into ORLP is the Outdoor Recreation Legacy program, and that specifically funds parks in low-income communities in cities. So that's something that we're working on right now.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Rachel, you already mentioned Park Pulse a little bit, that you're staying in contact with, the broad group of park users. What have you all been hearing about this on these equity questions?
Yeah, absolutely. We have worked with over 32 different communities in the last 3 years through the 10-minute walk, and specifically looking at issues of park access. And I think what we've learned through those last 3 years are only being brought to light in this current pandemic. And one of the things that was very clear from those cities is that every community is different, and park access looks very different community by community. It's a really nuanced question that's not just about, is there a park within a 10-minute walk? It's how many acres are within a 10-minute walk? What's the experience like at that park space? Is it safe? Is it inclusive? Do people feel welcomed in that particular place? And again, those questions come to light here, as we continue to close potentially regional parks, if they're becoming overcrowded, is there enough space in our neighborhoods for our communities to go? And that's why we're seeing some communities open streets, because really the answer is no, there's not enough space. So, I think one really important thing coming out of this will be to continue that momentum and try to take what has been brought to light into action. I think, as Karen mentioned, one of those things is funding. We know that before the pandemic, we have a very rough estimate that there was a $60 billion deferred maintenance across park systems in the United States. And that's just for current projects. That does not help us fill the current gaps that exist in access. And I'll give one example. We've been working with LA County. They were in an unincorporated area of Westmont, home to 30,000 people. Before we started working with them through the 10-minute walk, they only 35% of their residents had a park within that walking distance. And they found some land next to a library to build a new playground and some outdoor exercise equipment that actually provided an additional 7,000 residents with access. But now it's all closed because all that was provided in that amenity were playgrounds and fitness equipment and no access to outdoor nature space. So again, it's about those experiences that people are having in our park spaces. NRPA just published our working definition of what does access mean, and you'll see that it includes some of those nuances, and I would encourage you all to check that out if you're looking for more guidance on how you might define park access in your communities.
Great, thanks. I think we're going to turn to some audience questions now. So, and this first one follows immediately a discussion about equitable access. So, and then it also there's a reference here, NIMBYism or neighborhood resistance about providing access. So, Jesus, have you seen beyond what you talked about, closing parking lots, closing streets, with all the rich park and greenway resources of Seattle, have you seen creative solutions for getting people access to parks who do not live nearby?
Yeah, no, I think as I mentioned, I think the Open Streets to Safe Streets program, I think, is one. We were very careful about being supportive of that just in the beginning because we didn't want to create additional sort of congregation opportunities for folks. But the Department of Transportation has been thinking about which communities don't have open space and then looking at just opening those streets. But I think for us, the other part of it is about messaging, right? We're being very upfront about, if you have a backyard, stay there, right? Leave the parks for the folks who don't have backyards. And again, we're lucky, and notwithstanding all the things that Rachel talked about, in Seattle, we have a lot of green and open space in almost in every community. And so we're making sure that, as I mentioned at the beginning, when we made the decision to close our parks for the holiday weekend, we were pushing really hard to make sure that we kept the smaller parks open, because those are the ones that are in the neighborhoods for the folks who typically don't get out to the regional parks anyway. So, yeah, and in terms of the NIMBYism, I think we're for the most part, Seattleites are in this together, and they understand all the things we're trying to do and are very supportive of all the things we're trying to do to provide access.
Thanks. Yeah. Other comments from the talk show participants on this one? Creative solutions for getting people access.
The Houston B-Cycle group is still operating. They did close some of their stations where they're closer to larger, more utilized parks, but that's just a bike share system that we use as one example of, where our metro system may not be operating full force because of social distancing. We've had some transportation challenges when it comes to even getting people to work, not only just the parks, but that is one simple solution or opportunity for people to still bike and use those modes of transportation. But other than that, we're still trying to develop some other, solutions around transportation, or lack of transportation, should I say.
Yep. Okay. Rachel or Karen? Well, let's move on to another audience question. Let's see. Many clauses. Assuming we are in for the long haul, how can agencies address the reality that telling people to stay close to home and not drive means that poor folks, as usual, don't get access to the beautiful places? these are generally folks most at risk because they're at work. So it's a little, interesting juxtaposition here. There, in another field we work on at the YF Institute at National League of Cities, we were involved with cities in answering this question. Well, how do we make sure there's child care provision for first responders and essential workers? So I think this is coming from the same kind of mindset. This question about how do we make sure the people who need nature access the most have a chance to get it going forward. So it's continuing to layer on responses about equity. Rachel or Karen, would you want to kick this one off?
I would just build on what Jesus already said about the open streets. I don't think we can really underestimate the importance of that. The cities that I think are really on the cutting edge of addressing some of the equity issues are ones that are looking at open street programs. Vancouver has a very dense city, and they've opened a number of main roads. Even Montgomery County has been looking at opening up roads. It just gives people immediate access for being able to bike and walk and get to other places. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of that as a strategy right now.
Rachel, did you want to weigh in on this one?
Sure. I mean, I think this is a really tough question for us to grapple with, for park professionals, especially to grapple with, because we're so used to trying to attract people to our park spaces and places. So this shift in mentality is not what we're used to, and I think that closing streets is absolutely what we should be doing, and when possible, encouraging folks to stay home. But I also think it's the recommendation: if a place is too crowded, find a new park and go discover a new park in a different place that you may have never been. And I think it's just not sort of emphasizing the importance of not overcrowding a particular place. I think especially as this goes on, people are going to get bored of their local neighborhood park and want to go and explore. And so it will be important for us to sort of continue the messaging around going to a different park if a park space is crowded.
Yeah. Since it's National Poetry Month, I can't resist the urge to paraphrase Robert Frost and say, two roads diverge in a yellow wood, be sure to take the one less traveled by. So, but Jesus, what were you going to add?
Well, I was going to add, so I think it is a really tough question, and the challenge is, at least in Seattle, for example, we're still in a stay-at-home, stay safe, under stay-at-home, stay safe order. So the idea of parks and open space is just for exercise and walking, and I know it's a tough thing to keep pushing on, but I think as we begin to sort of ramp out of this, because a parallel conversation is resources and what's happening to our budget at this point. So we're going to have very limited resources. So I think it's going to be really important as we prioritize where we start to reinvest programming and activities, and when we start opening facilities back up, we really need to make sure that we're doing that with this lens that we go to the places that have the least access first. And I think that's going to be a really important fundamental criteria for us as we start to sort of ramp our operations back up.
Yeah. Jesus, you said the B word, budget, which is, I think it's going to come increasingly into focus here as we see the ripple effects of the pandemic and lower tax receipts and less economic activity. So, any insights from your two cities, or any broader perspective, Rachel and Karen, about funding challenges and how parks departments are preparing for likely budget cuts and thinking about, as Jesus says, applying an equity lens to how to keep operations going. Has that come up yet in Houston, Brandon?
100%. As of this past week, We've been told that we may have a budget deficit. I think we already had $100+ million budget deficit, and there may be upwards of $100+ million more tacked on top of that. Houston traditionally being an oil city, and the price of oil being below zero is impacting the city as a whole. So furloughs and layoffs will be coming to the city of Houston uh, pretty soon, unfortunately. And so that will impact parks and possibly library and some other departments within the city of Houston. So if nothing else, COVID-19 is teaching us how, one, to work with less, and then start being more creative on how we can kind of weave different resources together to continue doing the work that we need or that needs to be done in the city of Houston for our constituents. I'm open to other opportunities for funding resources and supplemental resources for what we do lack. But that is something that we are starting to spin our wheels around or turn our minds on to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Rachel, what's the discussion at NRPA about the impending fiscal challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. We are already doing surveying again on the fiscal future of our Park and Rec budgets. So already nearly half of the agencies that we have surveyed have received requests to make cuts to their current fiscal year budget. And then about 30% are being asked to make cuts to the next fiscal year budget. That budget cut has been in the range of about 10 to 20% of their budget. So we are going to see significant financial impacts. And I think it's really important in the recovery phase to highlight the critical, vital role that Parks and Recreation have in communities. We are just as important as other community services and deserve to be funded to support the health and well-being, the economic opportunities, and the environmental health of our communities.
Yeah. Karen, how have you been thinking about this at City Parks Alliance with your members?
Yeah, well, since half of our members are nonprofits, we're having a lot of conversations right now about the really critical role that the nonprofit park partners need to be playing in the future, the immediate future right now, and thinking about how do we leverage this crisis and the urgency for parks that has become so clear to support park budgets moving forward. That it has become so crystal clear that parks are such an essential public service, and equitable park access is absolutely critical to health. So how can park nonprofits and their constituents that they represent really step up to the plate at this point to stand by their park departments and advocate strongly that park departments are not the ones cut first? As we know, that park departments are often the ones and programs cut first and with the biggest cuts, and that just can't happen coming out of this given the urgency around park access right now. So we're talking to our nonprofit partners about how they can play a stronger role in ensuring that that message gets carried forward.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And as time declines in our rapid 60-minute talk show here, I want to be sure to put resources in front of our audience that both NRPA and City Parks Alliance and children and those of us in the Cities Connecting Children and Nature Network have been putting together. So tell us respectively, Karen, let's start with you. Tell us about the Park Exchange Resource Library and your webinar series, including another one tomorrow, and the backlog you've already developed, the back list you've already developed of really valuable conversations.
Yeah, so we've been doing webinars every other week since the beginning of this crisis. And for each of those webinars, we're doing extensive interviews and surveying of our members around the country and non-members around the country. The first one focused on just the general challenges, a lot of the conversation we're having here today, and the emergency responses that cities are having to do. The second one was focused on programming while social distancing. And a lot of those ideas I shared with you before of creative ways that cities are doing that is highlighted in that webinar. And then we have one coming up tomorrow that's planning for the summer and beyond in our parks. And that was in response to 80% of the people who listened to our last webinar in their post-webinar survey said that planning for the summer is basically what's on their mind the most right now. So we've got a good webinar with Seattle and Austin and Vancouver that will play tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And the resource library, which I know you showed a slide a minute ago with that, we've been, for each one of these webinars, we're collecting resources from all of our speakers and everybody we interview. And anything that will be a tool or a template that others can use to replicate, we're uploading that into our resource library, and that's accessible for folks who want to get into it.
Fantastic. Thanks for making that available. And let's skip back a slide, and Rachel, tell us how NRPA has been, gathering information and seeking to support the field.
Yep, absolutely. So the page you're seeing on the slide is our COVID-19 response page. It's continually updated on a daily basis with new blogs, guidance, statements, examples from the field, etc. So if you haven't visited that site, I would certainly recommend that you do so. I think to this question of looking ahead, on May 1st, we will be starting to roll out a Road to Recovery document that will help Park and Rec agencies understand how they should be beginning to open up facilities. Right now, we're certainly in the response phase. We'll talk about a recovery phase and then elevating their profession, or sort of rebuilding and continuing this momentum from the support that we have received for Parks and Open Space during the pandemic. One of the first documents will be a risk assessment, and it's based on guidance from Johns Hopkins University, as well as the WHO, the World Health Organization, the White House guidelines, and CDC guidance. And it will talk about things like contact intensity, number of contacts, and ability to modify the activities so that based on the activity type, you can make a decision of how and when to begin opening those facilities. For an example, parks are a place where there's typically low contact, typically less number of people, and it's easy to modify those activities. That would be an example of something that might open on the earlier end as compared to something like a sports team and youth sports activities. So that will certainly be coming in. Would encourage folks to watch out for those guidelines.
Yeah, thank you. And meanwhile, at National League of Cities and the Cities Connecting Children and Nature Initiative, we'll continue to get content out via the City Speak blog, via the Finding Nature website, recently stood up by our colleagues at Children and Nature Network. We'll have this monthly webinar series. You're witnessing the kickoff today. So we're getting close, very close to the end of our hour, and we've run out of time for questions, but happy to field those afterward via the CCCN team. I really want to thank Karen, Rachel, Brandon, and Jesus for joining us today as really helpful discussants and resource people for other cities. Wishing you all the best in your respective roles in your cities. And they will be posting many resource links as well as a recording of this webinar very soon. And we're eager to tell the stories of what cities are doing to maintain children's equitable access to nature. So get in contact with those of us on the CCCN team if you want to join the folks in Seattle and Houston who are making such a difference locally. Thanks for your time today, and thanks again to the presenters. Great discussion. Really enjoy being in this talk show format with you. Sorry I couldn't share my cup of tea around with all of you. We'll look forward to the day when that's again possible. Take care, all.
Andy.
Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.